Hello everyone, my name is Manasvi Khanna. I'm a student at Wellesley College. Today I will be presenting my research on the spatial analysis on the farmers' protest happening in India, my home country. Before I start talking about the statistics involved, I wanted to share with you the significance of this protest. Firstly, it is one of the largest protests ever seen in the world. Around 250 million protesters have gathered together for the cause, and honestly, it is one of the most organized efforts ever seen in South Asia. Second, this protest targets three changes in agricultural law that affect the primary economic sector of India. Third, these laws were reformed to protect the farmers and give them more marketing agency with fluctuation in price, making contracts, and also in storing groceries and products. However, farmers have expressed concerns about the loss of autonomy these laws bring on them. Now, to conduct the research, I used two different data sets. The first data set was acquired from ACLID, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, and some of the variables that came out of that data set were location, type of protest such as peaceful or riot or violent, unions associated, news source reporting the protest, and the scale of the news source. The second data set comprised of demographic information, and I gathered the population of each state and the agricultural population statistics from that data set. However, a thing to be noted is the data set from IPAM's Terra basically was from 2009, which is quite far off from the protest timeline, which started in late 2019. Now, moving on to the first research question that I looked at, is the level of violence and protest dependent on the agricultural population of that state? To do this, I aggregated the violent protests that happened in each state and also aggregated the agricultural population and calculated the percentages of it with the total population. Now, if we see the map, we can very clearly see that most of the violent protests were comprised in East India and a little bit in the West and mostly in the South. However, most news sources that we have seen have announced the level of violence and the measures taken by the government to control the protests that have been centered around the north and the center of the state, Delhi. Now, to check for the effect of agricultural population on the violence of the protests measured, I plotted a regression model and observed that basically there was no significant effect. The second thing that I did was run a Moran's-I test of autocorrelation on the residuals from the regression model and found again that the statistic was not significant. Had the statistic been significant, I would have further moved on to plot spatial models such as SAR, CAR, and lag to check for autocorrelation in these variables of violent protest and percentage of agricultural population. Now, to conclude, basically, the percentage of violent protests in the state is not dependent on the percentage of agricultural population of that state. Now, this is extremely important because a lot of the news sources and a lot of the resources are centered in the north. However, a lot of these violent protests that are happening and a lot of aggression is coming from different parts of the country and also worldwide. That said, a biggest drawback of this data set is the fact that the data for percentage of agricultural population is from 2009, which, like I said before, is 10 years off from our protest timeline. Now, to control for this in the future, the next steps that I would be taking is to find a relevant data set to measure agricultural prevalence in each state. Next, I would also be studying labor unions involved in these protests to measure which unions were actually advocating for peaceful protests and which were not. The next thing that I would be looking at would be spatial patterns and source scales through G functions and also SAR and CAR models. I will also be using KDE, which are kernel density estimate plots, and IPP models to measure the intensity of the protests reported at different news scales. I also want to take a second to thank Professor Claire Kelling, who was my mentor in this project and really helped me and pushed me and motivated me to keep researching this topic. I would also like to thank my family for supporting me and congratulating me on the journey that I have made to do this research and for continuing it. Thank you.